Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. Our guest today is former US diplomat Kurt Volker. He worked for the CIA, for the National Security Council and for NATO. He served as the US permanent representative to NATO during the administration of President George W. Bush. Kurt Volker today is the executive director of the John McCain Institute for International Leadership based at Arizona State University. That, of course, is the institute named after US Senator John McCain. And Kurt Volker joins me today from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for being on the program. I want to focus today mostly on Syria and NATO's role to this day. What's your sense of where the US administration is going on Syria? Is it too preoccupied with the fiscal cliff to do very much at the moment?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think part of it is the focus on domestic issues here, indeed the fiscal cliff and the economy and some of the social issues in the United States. There's also a sense that direct U.S. military intervention has not been successful in other cases and might be questionable in this case. So, for instance, the administration has pulled U.S. forces out of Iraq and is working on getting them out of Afghanistan starting in 2014. So there's a skepticism that a direct U.S. military engagement would be effective. If we look at Libya, for example, where there was a military intervention, the U.S. played an initial role in the air campaign, but then pulled back, providing only logistical and intelligence support, while others took the lead in the actual combat roles.
As a former ambassador to NATO, do you think that NATO is failing in some way? I mean, the fact that it's not stopping the bloodshed, it's standing more on the sidelines, of course, than in Afghanistan or Libya.
Right. I think in the case of NATO, you need to distinguish between two distinct roles. The first one is NATO's core mission, Article 5, collective defense, and that is to protect the territory of any NATO member. And here, NATO has indeed stepped up, deploying Patriot missiles to Turkey and making clear that it will act to defend Turkey's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the event of any attacks coming across from Syria. So on mission number one, NATO is being very robust. But then there is the second question. What about intervention inside Syria? What about stopping the killing that's going on there? NATO did act in Bosnia, it acted in Kosovo, it's playing a major role in Afghanistan, but NATO has so far been unwilling to take on any kind of intervention role with respect to Syria. It did this in the case of Libya. It did act to provide first a no-fly zone, and then individual NATO members worked with Qatar and the UAE to train and equip the rebels in Libya. But so far, NATO has made it clear it is not interested in repeating that kind of mission in Syria.
Do you agree with the calls of some members of Congress, including John McCain, about setting up a no-fly zone? Is that feasible operationally from your point of view?
It's feasible if the U.S. plays a substantial role. I think that these things won't happen without U.S. leadership. The U.S. needs to be willing to play an active role. And I do think it's feasible. I think that it is clearly the case that there is a substantial civil war going on in Syria. There are armed groups that are trying to organize, that are fighting back against the government. And there is tremendous pressure from government forces against the population and against these armed groups. As I said, over 40,000 people have already been killed. So it would seem to be that there would be a requirement for getting an air zone in place where you have a no-fly zone and you're preventing aerial attacks against the population, combining that with an on-the-ground safe zone where people can be safe inside Syrian territory rather than having to escape to neighboring Turkey, for example.
The on-the-ground bit is the rub, exactly, isn't it? Because that requires boots on the ground. I mean, if you want to protect civilians in dense urban areas from attack by Assad's forces, you need NATO troops. I mean, this is the real problem, isn't it? And I mean, no one's willing to go that far.
Well, and I think the key point is whose boots. It's not a question that it needs to be NATO boots on the ground. You do have, in the first instance, you have Syrian opposition militias that are already fighting, that have growing capacity, and they're getting assistance from outside groups that are improving their capacities. So that's the first step. The second is whether it might be a neighboring country such as Turkey, or a coalition that would involve other Arab countries such as the UAE and Qatar, as we saw in the case of Libya. So it need not be NATO boots on the ground. But there does need to be some kind of ground organizational effort going on just to provide basic security and safety for the citizens, which is under great pressure right now from Assad's forces.
So just to take a step back from it, I mean, you see basically both the US and other NATO members just sort of taking a step back in the next few months and seeing how things pan out, because they're clearly worried about the influence of jihadists, for example, in Syria. Do you think that the sort of wait-and-see approach is basically the one that's going to prevail for the next few months?
Well, it's what's happened for the last year already. This was a year ago. We could see where Assad was placing his bets, that he was going to do whatever was necessary to keep his regime in power, kill as many people as necessary to do that. And I think that the international community has wasted a year, in effect, of not acting more strongly to protect the population in Syria against that kind of regime force. I would expect that to continue. In fact, I think some of the announcements that we've heard about warning against any use of chemical weapons, by implication, mean that if there's no use of chemical weapons, then things will continue as they are.
Do you see a tipping point whereby some NATO members would go outside the international consensus and set up no-fly zones? Say there was a particularly gruesome massacre, or this winter the refugee situation got hugely worse than it is. Right.
First off, there is no international consensus at the moment. You have some countries that believe more should be done in Syria, and some countries, such as Russia, that are protecting Syria, or protecting the Syrian regime. So there's no consensus to begin with. And it's that inability to reach agreement through the UN or through a UN Security Council resolution that gives Assad a free hand to continue killing his own population. In the case of Kosovo in the late 90s, 1999, we also did not have an international consensus. But at that time, European states and the United States decided it was worth acting to protect that population. People talked about, at the time, humanitarian intervention. I think that is quite possible to imagine that happening again, but it would require determination and leadership from the United States and other countries.
Well, that's a key thing, determination, and across NATO members. And you've written in a foreign policy magazine article about a sort of a process of, in a sense, dilution of political will over the years, from Afghanistan, where some countries put caveats on their operations, through Libya, where other NATO countries didn't take part at all. Are we now seeing a sort of climax of some process where whatever happens, NATO just won't get involved?
I think in the case of Syria, that's right. I don't believe that NATO would be the instrument that would get involved, for several reasons. I think, first off, NATO has now gone to the position of limiting its activity to only what the UN Security Council would authorize and nothing more. In the case of Libya, that was to protect civilian populations, and NATO members strictly limited the NATO role to protecting that civilian population in the outset of that. When it was required to go beyond that, to train and equip the rebels in Libya, that was really done with a coalition on the margins of NATO involving the UAE and Qatar. I don't see the UN Security Council providing that same kind of authorization again. The Russians have made it clear they're against it, and they feel tricked by the Libya operation. And I don't see NATO, as a result, playing that kind of direct role. An outside coalition that might involve a few NATO members, the United States, perhaps France or the UK, along with countries from the Arab region, that's something that you could imagine.
What does that say, sort of, in very broad terms, about NATO's identity today in 2012? I mean, of course, originally it was, a deterrent force against the Soviet Union. It's gone through so many changes. Does anyone really know what it really is today?
I think that's an excellent question. NATO, at its 2010 summit in Lisbon, published a document called a strategic concept, which was intended to articulate what NATO's function is. But it was such an ambitious and grandiose set of functions, both collective defense and crisis management, dealing with traditional threats and dealing with non-traditional threats. And when you look at what's happened over the last 2 years, people are slashing defense budgets. We're shutting down operations. We've put enlargement on hold. So NATO is actually pulling back in its vision more towards what I would see as a traditional role of providing collective defense for its own members. And the crisis management roles, the expeditionary roles that NATO has been planning for and in some cases executing over the last 15 years, I think are shrinking and I think are very unlikely to be replicated in the near term. Our publics are not in favor of that. The political leadership is not in favor. The military capabilities among European allies are being slashed dramatically. And now we're beginning to see in the United States some cuts to our defense budget as well, which would make these things more difficult.
Just very briefly, a final point, Kurt Volker. Would NATO even have the money after these cuts you've mentioned to get militarily involved in Syria?
Well, again, if you look at the example of Libya, it's illuminating. The duration of the air campaign of about 6 months was beginning to put a strain on the budgets of some of the allies that were taking part in that. The French had an aircraft carrier that was off the coast of Libya. It had one, and it had to be put back into dock for some maintenance and repair during the course of the operation. The jets that the British were using in the case of the operation in Libya were ones that were scheduled to be mothballed, and their life was extended by several months in order to conduct the Libya operation. So if you look a year or two down the road, or even today, the forces that were there in Libya are not there now, and we're going to have fewer of them in the future. So this puts an even greater premium on the U.S. willingness to play a leading role in NATO, to be the backbone on which other allies align their forces. And if the U.S. is not willing to play that role as a leader of NATO, as seems to be the case now, then I don't see these operations getting together.
Okay, we'll end on that fairly somber note. Thank you so much, Kurt Volker, former US ambassador to NATO, speaking to me from Washington. And for more upcoming interviews, do by all means look up my Twitter handle @ArmandGeorgian. Do stay tuned to France 24.